Picture this. A woman so ruthlessly ambitious that she seduces her own uncle to marry him, murders her second husband with mushrooms, and then orchestrates her teenage son's rise to become the most notorious emperor in Roman history. Meet Agrippina the Younger, a woman who made Cersei Lannister look like an amateur and turned matricide into a mother-son bonding activity. She didn't just break glass ceilings in ancient Rome, she shattered them with poison-laced wine and political manipulation, so sophisticated it would make modern lobbyists weep with envy. But here's the twist that'll keep you awake tonight. Everything she did for love. Twisted, obsessive, murderous love, but love nonetheless. Before we dive into this deliciously dark rabbit hole of Roman family dysfunction, hit that subscribe button, because if you think your family has issues, wait until you meet the Julio Clodians. Let's start with a little context, shall we? Because understanding Agrippina the Younger is like trying to understand why people put pineapple on pizza. It seems wrong until you realize the circumstances that led to such questionable decisions. Born in 15 CE, Agrippina entered the world as Roman royalty, daughter of the beloved general Germanicus, and granddaughter of Augustus himself. Think of her as the equivalent of a modern-day princess. If princesses were raised in a world where political assassination was a legitimate career path, and family dinners regularly ended in exile or mysterious deaths. Her father Germanicus was Rome's golden boy, handsome, charismatic, militarily brilliant, and most importantly, not currently trying to murder anyone important. In Roman terms, this made him practically a saint. The people adored him, which naturally meant he had to die young, because apparently the universe has a sick sense of humor. When Agrippina was just 4 years old, Germanicus conveniently died under mysterious circumstances in Syria. Poison was suspected, because of course it was. This was Rome, where natural deaths were so rare they were considered supernatural phenomena. Now imagine being a 4-year-old girl, watching your mother, Agrippina the Elder, transform from grieving widow into a one-woman Justice League, demanding answers about your father's death. Young Agrippina learned her first lesson in Roman politics. If you want justice, you better be prepared to fight dirty, because the system certainly isn't going to hand it to you on a silver platter. Her mother's quest for justice went about as well as you'd expect in a world ruled by Tiberius. A man so paranoid he made Nixon look trusting, Agrippina the Elder found herself increasingly isolated. Her supporters mysteriously disappearing or suddenly discovering urgent business in distant provinces. It was like watching someone play chess against a grandmaster who's also allowed to set your pieces on fire. But here's where little Agrippina's education really began. She watched her mother rage against the machine and get systematically destroyed by it. She saw how noble intentions and moral righteousness got you exactly nowhere when facing an emperor who viewed mercy as a character flaw. Most children might have learned to keep their heads down and stay quiet. Agrippina learned something entirely different. If you can't beat the system through righteousness, maybe it's time to become the system. By age 13, Agrippina had witnessed her mother's exile to a remote island where she would eventually starve herself to death in protest. Because apparently the family had a flair for dramatic gestures. Her brothers faced similar fates. One exiled, another driven to suicide. The message was clear. The Julio-Claudian family tree was being aggressively pruned, and moral integrity was apparently not a survival trait. This is where most normal people would develop trust issues and maybe take up pottery or meditation. But Agrippina wasn't most people. She looked at the smoking ruins of her family's reputation and thought, you know what? I could do this better. It's like watching someone witness a horrific car crash and deciding that clearly the solution is to become a race car driver. She learned to smile at court while calculating who might be useful and who might be dangerous. She mastered the art of conversation that revealed nothing while gathering everything. She became fluent in the language of Roman politics, where, I hope you have a lovely day could mean anything from genuine well wishes to I hope you choke on your morning bread. The teenager who emerged from this political baptism by fire was sharp, beautiful, and absolutely ruthless in her pursuit of survival. She had learned the most important lesson of imperial Rome. In a world where your own family members might poison your wine, you better learn to poison theirs first. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned to weaponize the one thing Roman society told women they were good for: marriage. In a world where women couldn't hold political office, command armies, or even attend gladiator games without a male escort, Agrippina realized that the marriage bed was actually a throne room in disguise. Let that sink in for a moment. While other young Roman women were learning to embroider and manage households, Agrippina was studying the intricate dance of imperial succession like it was her doctoral thesis. She understood that in Rome, power didn't just flow through blood, it flowed through bedsheets. Now, if you think modern dating apps are complicated, try navigating romance when your potential matches include your own relatives, and every dinner date could literally be your last. Welcome to Agrippina's world, where swiping right could get you an empire or a cup of poison, sometimes both. At 17, Agrippina married her first husband, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. Before you strain your tongue trying to pronounce that mouthful of a name, just think of him as guy who peaked in high school. Domitius came from old Roman nobility, possessed considerable wealth, and had the personality of wet parchment. In modern terms, he was the equivalent of marrying your dad's business partner's son, because it looked good on paper and someone thought it would be practical. But here's where Agrippina showed her first flash of genius-level strategic thinking. While other young wives were focusing on being dutiful and decorative, she was studying her husband like a particularly boring textbook she needed to master for an exam. Domitius wasn't particularly bright, but he was predictable, and predictable people are wonderfully easy to manipulate. She gave him a son, the future Emperor Nero, though at the time he was just little Lucius, a chubby baby who probably had no idea he was destined to fiddle while Rome burned. Metaphorically speaking, of course, because violins wouldn't be invented for another 1,000 years. And historical accuracy matters even in the middle of family dysfunction. Domitius, meanwhile, was the kind of man who thought wife-beating was a legitimate form of conflict resolution, and that his noble blood gave him license to be terrible to everyone around him. He was, in essence, every toxic masculinity meme rolled into one toga-wearing package. Ancient sources describe him as violent, arrogant, and possessed of a temper that made Vesuvius look stable. But here's the beautiful irony. While Domitius thought he was the master of his household, Agrippina was quietly building a network that would have made LinkedIn jealous. She cultivated relationships with everyone from senators' wives to influential freedmen. She learned who owed whom favors, who harbored grudges, and who might be persuaded to look the other way when convenient. Think of it like this. While her husband was playing checkers and occasionally flipping the board when he lost, Agrippina was playing 4D chess with pieces he couldn't even see. She was the political equivalent of someone who appears to be casually scrolling through their phone while actually running a multinational corporation through encrypted messages. When Domitius died in 40 CE, conveniently some might say, Agrippina found herself a wealthy young widow with a small son, and suddenly unlimited options. She had learned everything she needed to know about managing difficult men, and now she was ready to upgrade to a more challenging target. Enter husband number 2, Gaius Sallustius Crispus Passienus, a man whose name was longer than most people's attention spans, but whose bank account was even more impressive. Passienus was rich, connected, and best of all, significantly older than Agrippina. In other words, he was perfect, temporary, useful, and unlikely to cause long-term complications. Passienus had been married to Agrippina's aunt, which in modern times would make this relationship slightly awkward at family gatherings. But in Roman high society, marrying your deceased aunt's husband was just Tuesday. It was like a very expensive game of musical chairs where everyone was related and half the players were plotting to poison the others. This marriage showed Agrippina's evolving strategy. She wasn't just collecting husbands, she was collecting resources, connections, and most importantly, legitimacy. Each marriage was like adding another tool to her political toolkit. Except instead of screwdrivers and hammers, she was collecting senators, inheritances, and social standing. Passienus, for his part, probably thought he was getting a beautiful young wife who would be grateful for his wealth and status. What he actually got was a woman who could have taught Machiavelli a thing or two about power dynamics. She played the role of devoted wife while systematically cataloguing his assets, his connections, and his weaknesses. The poor man never stood a chance. It's like watching someone bring a butter knife to a sword fight, except the sword is also poisoned, and the person wielding it has been planning this encounter for months. But here's what makes Agrippina's approach so brilliantly terrifying. She wasn't just using these men as stepping stones. She was studying the entire system of Roman power from the inside, learning how wealth translated to influence, how influence translated to political access, and how political access could be leveraged into real power. By the time Passienus mysteriously died in 47 CE, and yes, poison was suspected, because apparently that was Agrippina's signature move, She had transformed from a traumatized teenager into a sophisticated political operator. She had money, connections, experience, and most importantly, she had learned to see men not as masters or partners, but as resources to be managed. Some might call this cold-hearted manipulation. Others might call it the inevitable result of growing up in a system that gave women no direct path to power, while simultaneously making survival dependent on navigating that same system successfully. Either way, Agrippina was now ready for the big leagues. And the big leagues, in this case, meant seducing her own uncle to become Empress of Rome. Yes, you read that correctly. And somehow that's not even the strangest part of this story. Picture the most awkward family reunion you've ever attended. Now multiply that awkwardness by about 1,000, add imperial power struggles, and sprinkle in some light incest. Welcome to the Julio-Claudian family dynamic, where keeping it in the family wasn't just a saying, it was practically a constitutional requirement. When Agrippina set her sights on her uncle Claudius, she wasn't just thinking outside the box. She was setting the box on fire and dancing around the ashes. Claudius had recently become emperor in what was probably the most accidental rise to power in human history. After Caligula's assassination in 41 CE, the Praetorian Guard found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace, literally cowering in fear, and decided, well, he's related to Augustus, he's still breathing, and he seems too scared to cause trouble. Good enough. It was like accidentally becoming CEO because you happened to be in the supply closet when the board meeting went horribly wrong. Claudius was everything an emperor shouldn't be. He stuttered, he limped, he drooled slightly when nervous, and he had the social skills of someone who spent most of their time reading dusty scrolls about Etruscan drainage systems. His own family had been so embarrassed by him that they kept him locked away from public view for most of his life, like a shameful secret, or a really awkward relative you don't invite to weddings. But here's where Agrippina's genius really shined. She looked at this stammering, overlooked man, and saw opportunity where everyone else saw disappointment. While the rest of Rome was busy underestimating Claudius, Agrippina was calculating how to become the power behind a throne that nobody else particularly wanted. Think about the sheer audacity required for this plan. She was proposing to marry her father's brother, a man who had probably changed her diapers when she was a baby, and who now possessed the power to have her executed on a whim. It's like deciding to seduce your awkward uncle who suddenly inherited a Fortune 500 company, except the company controls the known world and has a military division. The problem was that Claudius was already married to Messalina, a woman who had turned adultery into an extreme sport. Messalina wasn't just unfaithful. She was creatively, publicly, magnificently unfaithful. She once held a competition to see who could sleep with the most men in a single night, and won by such a large margin that it became the stuff of legend. She was essentially the ancient Roman equivalent of someone who live-streams their bad decisions and somehow becomes famous for it. Messalina's approach to marriage was like treating fidelity as more of a suggestion than a requirement, and she had turned the imperial palace into something resembling a very expensive reality TV show about people making questionable life choices. But Messalina made one crucial error. She got legally married to her latest lover, while still married to the emperor. This wasn't just adultery, it was treason with a side order of "Are you completely insane?" Even by Roman standards, this was jaw-droppingly stupid. It's like embezzling from your company and then posting about it on social media while tagging your boss. When Claudius discovered his wife's public marriage ceremony to another man, even his legendary obliviousness couldn't ignore the implications. Messalina was swiftly executed, leaving Claudius suddenly single and in need of a new wife, preferably one who wouldn't try to overthrow him between breakfast and lunch. This was Agrippina's moment. While other potential candidates were probably updating their resumes and practicing their curtsy, Agrippina was already 3 moves ahead. She understood that Claudius wasn't just looking for a wife, he was looking for stability, competence, and someone who wouldn't publicly humiliate him while he was trying to run an empire. She presented herself as the anti-Messalina, dignified, intelligent, politically savvy, and most importantly, someone who understood that being Empress was a job, not just a title. Where Messalina had been chaos, Agrippina offered order. Where Messalina had been scandal, Agrippina offered respectability. The courtship was a masterclass in strategic psychology. Agrippina didn't throw herself at Claudius like a desperate social climber. Instead, she positioned herself as an advisor, a confidant, someone whose counsel was valuable, and whose presence was calming. She made herself indispensable before she made herself romantic. It's like the difference between someone sliding into your DMs with "Hey beautiful" and someone who becomes your trusted friend, helps you through difficult decisions, makes your life better, and then gradually makes you realize you can't imagine living without them. She studied Claudius's interests, his obsession with history, his love of legal precedents, his genuine desire to be a good emperor despite his personal limitations. She engaged with him intellectually, something most people had never bothered to do because they were too busy focusing on his physical awkwardness. But perhaps most cleverly, she brought her son Nero into the equation. Claudius, who had always been overlooked and underestimated, saw in young Nero a chance to mentor someone, to pass on his knowledge and ensure his legacy. Agrippina presented not just herself as a potential wife, but a ready-made family that could secure the imperial succession. The Senate, meanwhile, had to change the law to make uncle-niece marriage legal, because apparently even Roman lawmakers had some standards. But when you're dealing with imperial succession and political stability, a little creative legislation is a small price to pay. In 49 CE, Claudius married his niece in a ceremony that was probably the most politically calculated romantic gesture in history. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a hostile takeover disguised as a family reunion. And just like that, Agrippina went from widow to empress, from political outsider to the most powerful woman in the world. Not bad for someone whose entire family had been systematically destroyed just a few decades earlier. But becoming empress was just the beginning. Now she had to stay empress, secure her son's future, and navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics, while married to a man who was simultaneously the most powerful person in the world, and someone who got nervous ordering dinner. The real challenge was just getting started. If you've ever wondered what it would be like if a brilliant, ruthlessly ambitious woman suddenly found herself in charge of the world's most powerful empire, while married to a man who collected historical trivia as a hobby, well, wonder no more. Because that's exactly what happened when Agrippina became Empress of Rome, and the results were complicated. Most Roman empresses were expected to be decorative accessories, beautiful, silent, and about as politically relevant as the furniture. They were supposed to produce heirs, look stunning at public events, and maybe weave some really impressive tapestries in their spare time. Agrippina looked at these expectations and essentially said, "That's adorable, but I'll be running things now, thanks." From the moment she became empress, Agrippina began operating like she was co-emperor rather than emperor's wife. She attended meetings with foreign dignitaries, influenced policy decisions, and even had coins minted with her image alongside Claudius's, which was basically the ancient equivalent of insisting your name be on the company letterhead. This was revolutionary stuff. Roman women weren't supposed to have political power. They were supposed to influence their husbands privately and maintain the illusion that men were making all the decisions. Agrippina threw that playbook out the window and started writing her own rules, which probably gave traditional Roman senators the ancient equivalent of anxiety attacks. Claudius, for his part, seemed genuinely impressed by his wife's political acumen. Here was a man who had spent most of his life being underestimated and dismissed, suddenly married to a woman who not only took him seriously, but actually made him more effective as a ruler. It must have been like discovering you have a personal consultant who's also a strategic genius and happens to share your bed. But Agrippina wasn't just playing empress for the ego boost. Every move she made was calculated to secure her son Nero's path to the throne. This was long-term strategic planning that would have impressed a chess grandmaster. She was essentially playing a game where the stakes were global power, and the penalty for losing was death, and she was winning. First, she convinced Claudius to adopt Nero, making him heir apparent. This required some creative legal maneuvering, since Claudius already had a biological son, Britannicus, with his previous wife Messalina, but Agrippina managed to position Nero as the more suitable candidate through a combination of political pressure and probably some very persuasive late-night conversations. Think about the delicate psychology required here. She had to convince a man to essentially disinherit his biological child in favor of her son, while making it seem like it was his idea all along. It's like persuading someone to rewrite their will while they're watching TV, and having them thank you for the suggestion. She also orchestrated Nero's marriage to Claudius's daughter Octavia, which was basically political insurance wrapped in a wedding dress. Now Nero wasn't just the adopted son and heir, he was also the emperor's son-in-law. If imperial succession were a board game, Agrippina had just landed on Boardwalk and immediately started building hotels. But perhaps most impressively, Agrippina managed to maintain this level of political maneuvering while keeping Claudius genuinely happy in their marriage. Ancient sources suggest that despite the obviously calculated nature of their union, Claudius actually loved his wife and valued her counsel. She had somehow managed to be simultaneously manipulative and genuinely supportive, which is a psychological balancing act that would challenge trained therapists. This is where Agrippina's true genius becomes apparent. Lesser manipulators might have focused solely on personal gain, but she understood that her power was entirely dependent on Claudius's continued success and happiness. She made herself indispensable not through trickery, but through competence. She actually helped him become a better emperor, which in turn made her position more secure. It's like being hired as a consultant and being so good at your job that the company can't function without you. Except the company is the Roman Empire, and your performance review involves life or death decisions. She helped streamline the imperial bureaucracy, advised on foreign policy, and even influenced legal reforms. Ancient historians, despite their general bias against powerful women, grudgingly admit that Agrippina's influence generally improved imperial administration. She was like a really effective chief of staff who also happened to be sleeping with the boss. But maintaining this level of influence required constant vigilance. Roman politics were like a shark tank where the sharks had law degrees and family connections. Every day brought new potential threats, new rivals to manage, new crises to navigate. One wrong move, one moment of overconfidence, and she could find herself following in her mother's footsteps toward exile and death. The stress of managing an empire while securing her son's future, while maintaining her marriage, while watching for assassins, while dealing with senators who thought women should stick to household management, must have been absolutely exhausting. It's like being a CEO, a diplomat, a marriage counselor, and a bodyguard all at the same time, except failure in any role could result in execution. Yet, Agrippina thrived in this environment. She had found her element in the dangerous, high-stakes world of imperial politics. Where others saw threats and obstacles, she saw opportunities and resources. Where others saw chaos, she saw patterns she could manipulate to her advantage. For several years, it looked like she had achieved the impossible, real power in a system designed to exclude her, security in a world built on betrayal, and a clear path to dynastic succession in an empire where imperial families were usually lucky to survive one generation. But success in Roman politics was always temporary, and Agrippina was about to learn that even the most brilliant strategic minds could be undone by the one variable they couldn't fully control: other people's ambitions. The higher you climbed in Roman society, the more people wanted to push you off the ladder, and Agrippina had climbed very, very high indeed. Now, we need to talk about mushrooms. Not the kind you put on pizza or the kind that make college students think they can communicate with houseplants, but the kind that can quietly remove inconvenient husbands from the equation, while making it look like a tragic case of food poisoning. Welcome to Agrippina's masterclass in creative problem-solving, Ancient Rome edition. By 54 CE, Agrippina faced a problem that modern divorce lawyers would classify as complicated. Claudius, her useful but increasingly unpredictable husband, was starting to show signs of developing his own opinions about imperial succession. Specifically, he was beginning to favor his biological son Britannicus over Agrippina's son Nero. This was problematic for several reasons, not least of which being that Agrippina had spent the last 5 years building her entire future around Nero becoming emperor. Imagine spending years carefully constructing an elaborate house of cards, only to discover that someone is about to sneeze near it. That's essentially what Agrippina was facing. Except the house of cards was the Roman Empire, and the sneeze could result in her exile, execution, or worse, irrelevance. Claudius had started making noises about Britannicus being his true heir, and began including the boy more prominently in public ceremonies. He was even reportedly discussing the possibility of formally naming Britannicus as his successor, which would have effectively ended Nero's imperial prospects, and, by extension, Agrippina's political future. This created what management consultants might call a strategic divergence of interests, and what Agrippina probably called time to solve this permanently. Now, the exact details of what happened next are historically murky, which is often the case when discussing events that may or may not have involved premeditated murder. Ancient historians loved a good poisoning story, and they weren't always particularly concerned with things like evidence or proof. But the consensus is that Claudius died suddenly after eating a plate of mushrooms, and the timing was suspiciously convenient for certain parties. According to the most widely accepted account, Agrippina enlisted the help of a woman named Locusta, who was basically the ancient world's equivalent of a freelance consultant, specializing in discrete problem-solving. Locusta was what you might call a toxicology expert, though her expertise ran more toward the practical application of poisons rather than their antidotes. Think of Locusta as someone who had found a very specific niche market and built a successful business around it. She was like an artisan craftsperson, except instead of making pottery or jewelry, she made people permanently unavailable for future appointments. The plan was reportedly elegant in its simplicity. Claudius loved mushrooms, specifically a type of mushroom called Amanita sacerea, which was considered a delicacy among the Roman elite. It was expensive, rare, and absolutely delicious, which made it the perfect vehicle for delivery of less palatable ingredients. Agrippina arranged for Claudius's favorite mushroom dish to be prepared by his usual food taster, a woman named Flavius who was either complicit in the plan or remarkably unlucky in her career choices. The mushrooms were supposedly treated with poison from another mushroom variety, one that would cause symptoms that could easily be mistaken for a severe case of food poisoning. The beauty of this method was its plausible deniability. Mushroom poisoning was a known hazard. Even experienced foragers sometimes made fatal mistakes. If Claudius died from eating mushrooms, it would be tragic, but not necessarily suspicious. It was like the perfect crime hiding in plain sight, disguised as an unfortunate accident. On the evening of October 12, 54 CE, Claudius enjoyed his final meal. The mushrooms were reportedly delicious. Within hours he was experiencing severe stomach distress, which initially seemed like standard food poisoning, but his condition continued to deteriorate, and by the next morning the emperor was dead. The official cause of death was listed as accidental poisoning, which was probably the ancient equivalent of natural causes in terms of how seriously anyone investigated it. Claudius was 63 years old, not in perfect health, and had a known fondness for potentially dangerous foods. Case closed, nothing to see here. Let's move on to the succession question. But here's where the story gets really interesting from a psychological perspective. If Agrippina did orchestrate her husband's death, and the historical consensus suggests she probably did, she had just crossed a line that most people couldn't even see, let alone step over. This wasn't political maneuvering or strategic marriage. This was cold-blooded murder of someone who had genuinely loved and trusted her. The man who had made her empress, who had adopted her son, who had shared his power with her in ways that were revolutionary for the time, was now dead because he had outlived his usefulness to her ambitions. It's a level of ruthless pragmatism that makes modern corporate ruthlessness look like a children's tea party. Yet from Agrippina's perspective, this might have felt less like murder and more like self-defense. In the brutal world of Roman imperial politics, showing mercy or hesitation could be fatal. If she had allowed Claudius to name Britannicus as heir, it wouldn't just have ended her political career, it could have ended her life. Nero might have been executed as a potential rival, and she herself could have faced exile or worse. In her mind, she might have been protecting her son's future and her own survival. It was kill or be killed, just with better table settings and more sophisticated methods than a back-alley stabbing. The mushroom that killed Claudius didn't just end one man's life. It launched the reign of Nero and secured Agrippina's position as the mother of an emperor. In terms of return on investment, it was probably the most cost-effective political assassination in history. But success in Roman politics always came with a price, and Agrippina was about to discover that raising a future emperor is significantly more challenging than creating one. There's a parenting philosophy that suggests children are blank slates, shaped entirely by their environment and upbringing. Then there's the Agrippina school of child rearing, which suggests that children are strategic assets to be carefully molded into instruments of political power. The results were mixed. When 16-year-old Nero became emperor of Rome in 54 CE, he was essentially a teenager who had just inherited the world's most powerful job, while his mother watched from the wings like the ultimate helicopter parent. Except instead of worrying about his grades or social life, she was concerned about things like maintaining imperial authority and not getting assassinated by political rivals. Agrippina had spent years grooming Nero for this role, and her educational approach had been rather unconventional. While other Roman boys were learning rhetoric and philosophy in relatively normal circumstances, Nero was receiving private tutorials in how to rule the known world and advanced political manipulation. It was like homeschooling, but with significantly higher stakes and a curriculum that included subjects like strategic alliance building and identifying potential threats to your authority. She had hired the best tutors money could buy, including the philosopher Seneca, who was tasked with providing Nero with moral guidance and intellectual development. This was a bit like hiring a life coach for someone who was about to become dictator of the world. Theoretically helpful, but practically limited by the inherent contradictions of absolute power. Seneca, to his credit, tried to instill principles of justice, mercy, and wisdom in his young pupil. He wrote extensively about virtue and moral behavior, apparently hoping that philosophical education could somehow counteract the corrupting influence of unlimited power. It was an admirable effort, rather like trying to teach anger management to a volcano. But Agrippina's influence was constant and overwhelming. She didn't just want Nero to be emperor, she wanted to be the power behind the throne, the advisor whose counsel was always sought, the mother whose approval remained essential, even after her son had become the most powerful person in the world. This created a fascinating psychological dynamic. Nero was simultaneously the ruler of millions, and still subject to his mother's expectations and manipulations. Imagine being CEO of the world's largest corporation, while your mother still tells you to clean your room and eat your vegetables. Except instead of vegetables, she's telling you which senators to trust, and which foreign ambassadors to receive. For the first few years of Nero's reign, this arrangement actually worked relatively well. Agrippina's political experience and strategic thinking helped guide the young emperor through the complex challenges of ruling an empire. She was like a very experienced co-pilot, helping a new driver navigate heavy traffic, except the traffic consisted of potential assassins and political crises. Nero showed early promise as a ruler. He was charming, intelligent, and initially receptive to good advice. His early policies were generally sound, his public appearances were well received, and the empire ran smoothly under the guidance of his advisors. It looked like Agrippina's grand plan had worked. She had successfully placed her son on the throne, and positioned herself as the real power behind imperial decisions. But there were already signs of trouble brewing beneath the surface. Nero was developing interests that went beyond politics and administration. Specifically, he was becoming fascinated with art, music, and performance. This might seem harmless, but in Roman culture these were not considered appropriate pursuits for emperors. It was like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company announcing that they were more interested in interpretive dance than quarterly earnings reports. Roman emperors were expected to be military leaders, legal scholars, and political strategists. They were supposed to project strength, dignity, and gravitas. They were not supposed to write poetry, perform in theatrical productions, or spend hours practicing the lyre. But Nero was showing signs of wanting to do all of these things, much to his mother's growing concern. Agrippina had created an emperor, but she was discovering that emperors, even ones she had carefully shaped from childhood, had their own personalities, desires, and ambitions. It's like building a sophisticated robot and then realizing that it has developed its own ideas about what it wants to do with its time. She tried to redirect his interests toward more traditionally imperial pursuits. She arranged meetings with military commanders, encouraged his participation in legal proceedings, and made sure he was visible at important state functions. But Nero was increasingly restless with these formal responsibilities, finding them boring compared to the creative pursuits that genuinely excited him. This created tension that went beyond typical mother-son conflicts. Agrippina had sacrificed everything, including possibly her husband's life, to secure Nero's position as emperor. She had invested years of careful planning and political maneuvering to reach this point. The idea that her son might squander this opportunity by preferring art to administration must have been infuriating. But Nero was also coming of age and developing the natural desire for independence that most teenagers experience. Except his rebellion involved the potential to reshape the Roman Empire according to his personal preferences. When most kids rebel against their parents, the worst-case scenario is bad grades or questionable fashion choices. When Nero rebelled against Agrippina, the consequences could affect millions of people. The fundamental problem was that Agrippina had been too successful in securing power for her son. She had made him emperor, but she hadn't found a way to ensure that he would remain the type of emperor she wanted him to be. She had given him ultimate authority while expecting him to continue deferring to her judgment, which was a contradiction that couldn't last indefinitely. As Nero grew more confident in his position, and more interested in pursuing his own agenda, The stage was being set for a conflict that would ultimately determine whether Agrippina would remain the power behind the throne, or become an obstacle to be removed. Mother-son relationships are complicated enough under normal circumstances. When the son in question rules the known world, and the mother has a history of solving problems with poison, things tend to get exponentially more complex. Picture the moment when a helicopter parent realizes their child has grown up and no longer needs or wants constant supervision and guidance. Now imagine that child is the Emperor of Rome. The helicopter parent is a woman who has murdered her way to the top of the political food chain, and growing independence involves decisions that affect the fate of millions. Welcome to the Agrippina-Nero relationship circa 59 CE, where family therapy wasn't an option and conflict resolution tended to involve considerably more bloodshed than your average family feud. The first major crack in their relationship appeared when Nero fell in love. Not the strategic, politically advantageous kind of love that Agrippina had carefully orchestrated throughout her own life, but the messy, inconvenient, absolutely disastrous kind of love that makes people do spectacularly stupid things while believing they're following their hearts. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she was everything a Roman empress should not be: already married, politically ambitious in her own right, and possessed of the kind of beauty that made men forget they had responsibilities. She was essentially the ancient equivalent of someone who could launch 1,000 ships and sink them all before lunch, just for the entertainment value. Nero was completely smitten. This wasn't just teenage infatuation. This was the kind of obsessive passion that makes rational people write terrible poetry and make decisions that future historians will struggle to explain. He started spending more and more time with Poppaea, listening to her advice, and increasingly viewing his mother's counsel as outdated and unnecessarily restrictive. Agrippina, with her finely tuned political instincts, recognized the threat immediately. Poppaea wasn't just a romantic distraction. She was a rival for influence over the emperor, and unlike previous challenges to Agrippina's authority, this one involved genuine emotion, which made it infinitely more dangerous and unpredictable. Think about the psychology at play here. Agrippina had spent her entire adult life managing men through a combination of intelligence, manipulation, and strategic thinking. She understood how to leverage desire, ambition, and fear to achieve her goals, but genuine love, the irrational, all-consuming kind that makes people ignore practical considerations, was much harder to counter with traditional political tactics. She tried her usual approaches first. She attempted to discredit Poppaea, pointing out her existing marriage and her questionable reputation. She reminded Nero of his duties as emperor and the importance of maintaining appropriate relationships. She probably deployed every argument in the political parent's handbook, from appeals to duty to warnings about public perception. But Nero was no longer the malleable teenager she had guided to power. He was a young man with absolute authority who had discovered that being emperor meant he could, theoretically, do whatever he wanted. This realization was probably both liberating and terrifying, like suddenly discovering you have superpowers but no instruction manual for how to use them responsibly. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Nero was still married to Octavia, Claudius's daughter. This marriage had been one of Agrippina's strategic masterstrokes, cementing Nero's connection to the imperial family, but it was also a political arrangement rather than a love match, and Nero had grown increasingly resentful of what he saw as another aspect of his life that had been decided for him rather than chosen by him. Agrippina found herself in the unprecedented position of having her advice ignored, her authority questioned, and her carefully constructed plans threatened by something as unpredictable as human emotion. It must have been like watching years of careful engineering collapse, because someone decided to use the blueprint as kindling. She escalated her efforts, using her network of allies and informants to gather intelligence on Poppaea and her supporters. She made veiled threats about the consequences of ignoring maternal wisdom. She probably reminded Nero, in increasingly direct terms, that everything he had, his throne, his power, his very survival, was owed to her sacrifices and strategic planning. But these tactics, which had worked so well in the past, began to backfire. Instead of reasserting her authority, they made Nero more aware of just how extensively his life had been managed and manipulated. It's like finally realizing that your helpful friend has actually been controlling every aspect of your social life. The gratitude quickly turns to resentment. Nero began to see his mother's influence not as protection and guidance but as control and limitation. He started to question whether her advice was really in his best interests or primarily designed to maintain her own position. This was probably the first time he had seriously considered the possibility that his mother might have her own agenda that didn't perfectly align with his happiness or success. The conflict intensified when Agrippina made what turned out to be a crucial strategic error. She overplayed her hand, frustrated by Nero's increasing independence and possibly panicked by the threat to her position. She reportedly began making not-so-subtle references to her role in placing him on the throne, and her ability to remove him just as effectively. This was a miscalculation of epic proportions. Threatening someone with ultimate power rarely works out well for the person making the threats, especially when that someone has grown up watching how political problems are typically resolved in Imperial Rome. It was like threatening to ground someone who has access to nuclear weapons. Technically possible, but inadvisable from a personal safety perspective. Nero's response was probably a mixture of anger, fear, and the dawning realization that his mother might represent a genuine threat to his continued reign. The woman who had been his greatest protector and advocate had just revealed that she could also be his most dangerous enemy. From this point forward, the relationship between mother and son would be defined not by collaboration and shared goals, but by mutual suspicion and the question of who would eliminate whom first. In the brutal logic of Roman imperial politics, there was no middle ground between absolute loyalty and mortal enemies. The stage was set for a confrontation that would make previous family disputes look like minor disagreements about dinner plans. There's something particularly tragic about watching a relationship that began with unconditional love transform into a deathmatch between two people who still, on some level, genuinely care about each other. It's like watching a romantic comedy turn into a thriller halfway through, except the stakes involve the Roman Empire, and everyone has access to professional assassins. By 58 CE, the Agrippina-Nero dynamic had evolved from loving mother-son partnership to something resembling a Cold War fought with passive aggression, political maneuvering, and increasingly creative attempts at mutual destruction. It was family dysfunction elevated to an art form, with the added complexity that both parties had the resources to make their disagreements historically significant. Agrippina, realizing that direct confrontation had only strengthened Nero's resolve to assert his independence, shifted to more subtle tactics. She began cultivating relationships with senators who might be sympathetic to her concerns about the emperor's leadership. She started making carefully worded comments about the importance of experienced guidance in imperial decision-making. She even reportedly began suggesting that perhaps Britannicus, Claudius's biological son, who was still alive and conveniently legitimate, might be a more suitable ruler if Nero continued to prove unreliable. This was nuclear-level family manipulation. Agrippina was essentially threatening to replace her own son with someone else's child, which was either brilliant strategic thinking or the kind of psychological warfare that would have impressed Machiavelli. It was like telling your teenager that you're considering adopting their more responsible cousin and making them your heir instead. Nero, for his part, responded with the kind of creative rebellion that only unlimited power can enable. He began systematically removing his mother's allies from positions of influence. He started making important decisions without consulting her. He even had her portrait removed from coins and public monuments, which was basically the ancient equivalent of unfriending someone on social media, except with more lasting historical significance. But the real escalation came when Nero decided to divorce Octavia and marry Poppaea. This wasn't just a personal decision, it was a direct challenge to everything Agrippina had worked to achieve. The marriage to Octavia had been a cornerstone of Nero's legitimacy, connecting him to Claudius's family line and reinforcing his claim to the throne. Agrippina saw this divorce as catastrophic on multiple levels. Politically, it weakened Nero's position and potentially created enemies within the imperial family. Personally, it represented a complete rejection of her judgment and planning, and strategically it meant that Poppaea would replace her as the primary female influence on the emperor. The divorce proceedings became a proxy war between mother and son. Agrippina marshaled legal arguments about the impropriety of the divorce and the political dangers of alienating Octavia's supporters. She made public appearances with Octavia, presenting themselves as the wronged women standing against imperial caprice. She even reportedly considered fleeing Rome to gather support from provincial governors who might be sympathetic to her cause. Nero countered by accelerating the divorce process and beginning preparations for his marriage to Poppaea. He made it clear that his mother's approval was no longer required for his personal decisions. He started appearing in public without her, breaking the pattern of joint appearances that had characterized the early years of his reign. The situation reached a crisis point when Agrippina reportedly made her most dangerous move yet. She began suggesting that Britannicus, now approaching adulthood, might be a more suitable emperor than Nero. This was treason disguised as maternal disappointment, and everyone involved understood the implications. In Roman imperial politics, suggesting that someone else should be emperor was tantamount to declaring war. It didn't matter that Agrippina was Nero's mother. She was now positioning herself as a threat to his continued reign. It was like a chess game where one player suddenly announced they were switching sides and taking their pieces with them. Nero's response was swift and decisive. In 55 CE, Britannicus died suddenly during a dinner party, reportedly from poison administered in his wine. The death was blamed on an epileptic seizure, but the timing was suspiciously convenient for Nero's interests. It was the kind of coincidence that nobody really believed but everyone pretended to accept because the alternative was too politically dangerous to acknowledge. The message was clear. Nero was no longer the obedient son who would tolerate threats to his authority, even from his own family. He had learned his mother's lessons about eliminating obstacles too well, and now those lessons were being applied to her. Agrippina must have realized in that moment that she had created something beyond her control. The son she had shaped into an emperor was now using the skills she had taught him against her. It's like training someone to be a master strategist and then discovering that you're now their primary target. But rather than retreating or seeking reconciliation, both mother and son doubled down on their positions. Agrippina continued to build networks of potential supporters, while Nero worked to isolate her from sources of power and influence. They were engaged in a slow-motion assassination attempt on each other's political positions, with the winner getting to control the Roman Empire and the loser getting to be dead. The tragedy is that both of them were probably acting from genuine conviction. Agrippina believed she was trying to save the empire from her son's increasingly erratic behavior. Nero believed he was defending his rightful authority from a manipulative threat to his reign. They were both right, and they were both wrong, and the collision between their competing truths was becoming inevitable. The only question remaining was who would strike first, and whether either of them would survive the impact. In a conflict between two people who had both mastered the art of political murder, the outcome was likely to be spectacular, decisive, and absolutely devastating for at least one party involved. Love had indeed become war, and in Roman imperial politics, wars typically ended with someone dying in a particularly memorable fashion. Nothing says our relationship has reached a point of no return, quite like your own son trying to kill you with a collapsible boat designed to look like an accident. It's the kind of family conflict resolution method that makes normal parent-child arguments about curfews and allowances seem almost quaint by comparison. By 59 CE, Nero had apparently decided that the Agrippina problem required a permanent solution, but he wanted it to look like divine intervention rather than matricide. This created an interesting engineering challenge. How do you murder your mother in a way that appears accidental while ensuring the method is actually effective? It's like a very dark episode of How It's Made, except instead of manufacturing candy or car parts, we're discussing the construction of a death trap disguised as luxury transportation. The plan that Nero and his advisors devised was brilliantly theatrical and completely insane in equal measure. They would invite Agrippina to a festival at Bergea, a fashionable resort town on the Bay of Naples, where wealthy Romans went to relax and pretend they weren't constantly plotting against each other. The invitation would be presented as a gesture of reconciliation, a chance for mother and son to repair their relationship in a beautiful, peaceful setting. Agrippina, who had survived decades of Roman politics by being suspicious of everything and everyone, was apparently touched by this apparent olive branch from her son. This suggests either that maternal love can overcome even the most finely tuned survival instincts, or that she was confident in her ability to handle whatever trap Nero might be setting. Either way, she accepted the invitation, which in hindsight seems like the ancient equivalent of agreeing to meet someone in a dark alley after they've been sending you anonymous, threatening messages. The festival itself went smoothly. Nero was charming, attentive, and apparently genuinely affectionate toward his mother. They shared meals, attended entertainments, and gave every appearance of having resolved their differences. Ancient observers noted how happy Agrippina seemed, how relaxed the atmosphere was, and how pleasant it was to see the imperial family getting along. This performance was probably the most challenging acting job of Nero's career. He had to appear loving and sincere, while knowing that he was planning to kill the woman who had sacrificed everything to make him emperor. It's psychological complexity that would challenge trained method actors, let alone someone who was primarily known for playing the lyre and writing questionable poetry. The climax of the festival was supposed to be Agrippina's return journey to her villa across the bay. Nero had arranged for a specially constructed ship to transport her, a vessel that appeared luxurious and seaworthy, but was actually designed to collapse or sink once it reached deep water. The engineering involved was reportedly quite sophisticated, involving hidden mechanisms that could cause the cabin roof to collapse or the hull to open and flood. Think of it as the ancient world's equivalent of the elaborate Rube Goldberg machine. Except instead of being designed to crack an egg or ring a bell, it was designed to commit matricide while providing plausible deniability. The plan was that Agrippina would die in what appeared to be a tragic boating accident, leaving Nero free to grieve publicly while privately celebrating his liberation from maternal oversight. Agrippina boarded the ship, probably still glowing from what had seemed like a successful reconciliation with her son. The vessel set out across the calm waters of the bay under a star-filled sky, carrying its deadly secret and its unsuspecting victim toward what should have been her final destination. And then, in a twist that even Hollywood screenwriters would reject as too implausible, the plan actually worked, sort of. The ship's mechanisms activated as designed. The cabin roof collapsed, and the hull began taking on water. Panic ensued among the passengers and crew as the vessel started to sink in the middle of the bay. It should have been game over for Agrippina, a tragic end to a remarkable life, attributed to mechanical failure or divine disfavor. But here's where the story takes a turn that demonstrates why Agrippina had survived so long in the deadly world of Roman imperial politics. She was apparently unsinkable in more ways than one. When the roof collapsed, it struck and killed one of her companions, but missed Agrippina herself. When the ship began sinking, she didn't panic or wait for rescue. She jumped into the water and started swimming toward shore. Ancient sources report that despite being in her 40s and wearing the kind of elaborate clothing that would normally guarantee drowning, she managed to swim several miles through dark waters to reach safety. Picture the scene: the most powerful woman in Rome, soaking wet, exhausted, probably still wearing jewelry and silk robes, dragging herself onto a beach while behind her the evidence of her son's murder attempt disappears beneath the waves. It's like something from an action movie, except the hero is a middle-aged mother who has just realized that her child is trying to kill her. The psychological impact of this experience must have been devastating. Agrippina had always known that imperial politics were dangerous, but discovering that her own son, the child she had raised, protected and placed on the throne, was actively trying to murder her must have been a betrayal beyond anything she had previously experienced. But even more remarkably, she apparently decided to pretend that nothing had happened. Rather than fleeing Rome or raising an alarm, she sent a message to Nero, reporting that she had survived a terrible accident and was grateful for divine protection. She was essentially calling his bluff, forcing him to maintain the pretense that he was concerned for her welfare while both of them knew exactly what had really happened. This was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated, pretending to believe your son's lies about caring for your safety, while making it clear that you know he just tried to kill you, all while maintaining plausible deniability for both parties involved. The failed boat plot had accomplished something that years of political maneuvering hadn't. It had finally made the conflict between Agrippina and Nero explicit and immediate. There was no going back from attempted matricide, no pretending that their differences could be resolved through compromise or negotiation. One of them was going to have to die, and soon. The only question was which one would prove more effective at completing the task. There are survival stories, and then there's swimming several miles through dark Mediterranean waters, while wearing formal Roman attire after your own son just tried to kill you with a collapsible boat. Agrippina's midnight swim to shore wasn't just physically impressive. It was probably the most dramatic "I'm not dead yet" statement in political history. Picture the moment when she first felt the cabin roof collapsing above her. The confusion, the panic of other passengers, the realization that the beautiful ship her loving son had provided was actually a floating death trap. Most people would have frozen in terror or been crushed by the psychological weight of such profound betrayal. But Agrippina apparently assessed the situation with the cold calculation of someone who had been expecting attempted murder for years. She just hadn't expected it to come from this particular direction. The fact that she immediately jumped into the water and started swimming suggests a level of presence of mind that's almost superhuman. This wasn't just survival instinct, this was strategic thinking under extreme duress. She could have tried to stay with the wreckage and hope for rescue, but that would have left her vulnerable to helpful rescuers who might complete the job the boat had started. Swimming to shore meant taking control of her own survival, rather than trusting anyone else to preserve her life. Think about the physical challenge involved. Agrippina was probably in her mid-40s, which in Roman times made her practically elderly by political standards. She would have been wearing the kind of elaborate clothing appropriate for an imperial festival: heavy fabrics, jewelry, possibly ceremonial shoes. Swimming in such attire would be like trying to do laps while wearing a wedding dress and combat boots. But the psychological challenge was probably even more daunting. With every stroke toward shore, she had time to process what had just happened. Her son, the child she had raised from infancy, had just attempted to murder her. The boy she had protected, educated, and placed on the throne of the world's most powerful empire had decided that his mother was an obstacle to be eliminated, rather than an advisor to be valued. The betrayal must have been crushing. Agrippina had experienced political treachery before. It was practically the family business, but this was personal in a way that nothing else had been. She had been betrayed by enemies and rivals throughout her life, but she had never been betrayed by someone she genuinely loved, and had sacrificed everything to protect. Yet she kept swimming through physical exhaustion, emotional devastation, and probably hypothermia. She kept moving toward shore. It's the kind of determination that suggests someone who had decided that dying was not an acceptable option, regardless of how attractive it might seem, given the circumstances. When she finally reached land, probably somewhere along the coastline near her own villa, she faced another crucial decision: how to respond to what had just happened. She could flee Rome immediately, seeking sanctuary with provincial governors who might be sympathetic to her cause. She could raise an alarm, publicly accusing Nero of attempted matricide. She could gather her remaining supporters and attempt a coup against her own son. Instead, she chose the most psychologically sophisticated response possible. She pretended nothing had happened. Agrippina sent a message to Nero informing him that she had survived a terrible boating accident and was grateful to the gods for her preservation. The message was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive communication, simultaneously acknowledging the incident while maintaining the fiction that it had been accidental. She was essentially saying, "I know what you did, you know what you did, but we're going to pretend this was just an unfortunate mechanical failure." This response was brilliant for several reasons. First, it forced Nero to continue the charade of being a concerned son, which must have been psychologically uncomfortable for someone who had just attempted matricide. Second, it bought her time to assess her options and plan her next move. Third, it demonstrated that she was still sharp enough to play political games, even after nearly drowning, which might give him pause about future assassination attempts. But perhaps most importantly, it maintained plausible deniability for both parties. By pretending to believe the accident story, she was offering Nero a chance to step back from the brink of open warfare. It was like extending an olive branch while making it clear that she knew exactly where the previous olive branch had led. Nero's response to her message reveals the psychological complexity of their relationship even at this point. According to historical accounts, he was initially terrified when he learned that his mother had survived. Not just disappointed that his plan had failed, but genuinely frightened of what she might do next. This suggests that despite everything that had happened between them, he still respected her capabilities and feared her potential for retaliation. But then something interesting happened. Instead of relief that she was alive, or guilt about what he had attempted, Nero apparently became angry that she had survived. It's like the psychological equivalent of being frustrated that your murder plot wasn't more effective, which suggests a level of commitment to matricide that goes beyond simple political calculation. The failed boat assassination had created a new dynamic between mother and son. Both of them now knew that their conflict had escalated beyond the point of peaceful resolution. Nero had demonstrated his willingness to kill his own mother, and Agrippina had demonstrated her ability to survive his attempts. The pretense of family reconciliation was over, replaced by a deadly game of cat and mouse where both parties were simultaneously predator and prey. From this point forward, every interaction between them would be shadowed by the knowledge that one had tried to murder the other, and might well try again. Family dinners would never be quite the same when you know your son has recently attempted to kill you with innovative marine engineering. But Agrippina's survival had also demonstrated something important. She was still a formidable opponent, even when caught off guard. Nero might have the resources of an empire at his disposal, but his mother had something potentially more valuable: the experience of someone who had been underestimated before, and lived to tell about it. The question now was whether her survival skills would be enough to protect her from someone who had unlimited power and was apparently willing to use it against his own family. After surviving her son's elaborate boat-based murder plot, Agrippina found herself in a uniquely awkward position. She was alive, soggy, and acutely aware that her loving child had just tried to kill her with what was essentially a maritime death trap. Most mothers might have taken this as a sign that family relationships had deteriorated beyond the point of Christmas card exchanges. But Agrippina wasn't most mothers. She was a woman who had spent decades turning impossible situations into strategic advantages. The immediate aftermath of her dramatic swim to shore must have been surreal. Here she was, one of the most powerful women in the world, sitting on a beach in the middle of the night, dripping wet and contemplating the fact that her son had just attempted matricide with all the subtlety of a Rube Goldberg machine designed by someone with serious family issues. It would have been perfectly reasonable for her to have what psychologists might call a moment. Instead, she apparently went straight into crisis management mode. This wasn't just survival. This was damage control at the highest level of Roman politics. She had to figure out how to respond to an assassination attempt that everyone would pretend hadn't happened, while positioned herself for whatever Nero might try next. Her decision to send that carefully worded message to Nero, the one pretending the boat collapse had been an accident, reveals the sophisticated psychological chess game she was playing. She wasn't just buying time. She was forcing him to confront the implications of his actions while maintaining the fiction that would allow both of them to continue functioning within the imperial system. Think about the emotional complexity involved. Part of her must have still loved the son she had raised, protected, and sacrificed for. Part of her probably understood that in the brutal world of Roman imperial politics, family members often became enemies. It was practically a tradition, and part of her must have been calculating how to survive what was clearly becoming an existential threat to her. Continued breathing. But here's where Agrippina's decades of political experience really showed. Instead of retreating or going into hiding, she did something that must have driven Nero absolutely insane with frustration. She continued to act like the emperor's mother. She maintained her household, received visitors, attended public functions when appropriate, and generally conducted herself as if nothing significant had changed in their relationship. This was psychological warfare disguised as maternal dignity. Every public appearance she made was a reminder that Nero's murder plot had failed. Every day she remained alive and visible was proof that he wasn't as competent at assassination as he had thought. Every normal interaction she had with other members of the imperial court was a demonstration that she still possessed political relevance and social connections. Nero, meanwhile, was discovering that failed matricide creates its own unique set of problems. He couldn't exactly complain publicly that his mother had survived what was supposed to look like an accident. He couldn't try the same method again without it becoming obviously suspicious, and he couldn't simply ignore her continued existence because she was still technically the emperor's mother and a significant political figure in her own right. The situation was made even more complex by the fact that other people in the imperial court were watching this family drama unfold with the kind of fascination that people usually reserve for particularly spectacular disasters. Everyone knew what had really happened on that boat, but everyone also knew that acknowledging it would be politically dangerous and socially inappropriate. It was like being trapped in the world's most deadly game of pretend, where everyone has to maintain the fiction that everything is fine, while knowing that mother and son are engaged in a slow-motion death match that could reshape the empire, depending on who wins. Agrippina used this awkward situation to her advantage in ways that were probably both brilliant and infuriating. She would make casual references to her fortunate survival of the boating accident, with just enough emphasis to make it clear that she knew it hadn't been an accident while maintaining plausible deniability. She would express gratitude for divine protection in a tone that suggested she knew her preservation had been more a matter of superior swimming skills than celestial intervention. She also began to subtly rebuild her network of allies and informants. The failed assassination attempt had actually strengthened her position in some ways, because it demonstrated that she was still significant enough to be worth killing. In Roman politics, being targeted for elimination was almost a form of flattery. It meant you were important enough to matter. But perhaps most cleverly, she started to document things, not obviously or dramatically, but she began to ensure that there were witnesses to her interactions with Nero, records of her activities, and people who could attest to her continued loyalty to the empire and appropriate behavior as the emperor's mother. She was essentially creating an insurance policy made of testimony and evidence. This documentation served multiple purposes. It made future assassination attempts more difficult because her disappearance would be noticed and investigated by people who were expecting something to happen. It created a paper trail that would make it harder for Nero to justify any actions against her, and it demonstrated to potential allies that she was still thinking strategically rather than simply reacting to threats. The psychological pressure on both of them must have been enormous. Agrippina was living with the knowledge that her son had tried to kill her, and would likely try again. Nero was living with the knowledge that his murder plot had failed, and that his mother was now aware of his intentions while continuing to present herself as a threat to his autonomy. It was like a chess game, where both players were trying to achieve checkmate while pretending they were just enjoying a friendly match, and where losing meant dying rather than just having to put the pieces away. The tension was building towards something that would have to resolve itself, one way or another. In Roman imperial politics, sustained conflict between family members rarely ended with everyone agreeing to disagree and moving on with their lives. Someone was going to win this contest, and someone was going to lose permanently. The only question was who would prove more skilled at the family business of strategic elimination. There comes a moment in every high-stakes psychological battle when subtlety gives way to desperation, and careful planning collapses into let's just get this over with. For Nero and Agrippina, that moment arrived when it became clear that elaborate boat-based murder plots were apparently insufficient for resolving their mother-son differences, and that more direct methods might be necessary. Nero, faced with the embarrassing failure of his maritime assassination attempt, and the ongoing problem of having a mother who insisted on remaining both alive and politically relevant, found himself in the ancient equivalent of a very dark corner. He had already crossed the line into attempted matricide, which meant there was no going back to family harmony and shared governance. He had demonstrated his willingness to kill Agrippina, and she had demonstrated her ability to survive his efforts. This created a stalemate that could only be resolved through escalation. The psychological pressure on Nero during this period must have been extraordinary. He was trying to rule an empire while engaged in a death match with his own mother, maintaining public appearances while planning private murder, and dealing with the growing realization that Agrippina might be better at this game than he was. It's like trying to perform brain surgery while someone is actively trying to sabotage your instruments. Except the brain surgery is running the Roman Empire, and the saboteur is the person who taught you everything you know. Agrippina, meanwhile, was playing what she must have known was her final hand. She had survived one assassination attempt through a combination of luck, skill, and superior swimming ability, but she couldn't count on being that fortunate indefinitely. She needed to either neutralize the threat Nero represented, or find a way to make herself too valuable to kill. Her strategy appears to have been a fascinating combination of defensive positioning and offensive maneuvering. She continued to maintain her public presence and political connections, making herself visible enough that her disappearance would be noticed and investigated. But she also began to make subtle moves that suggested she might be preparing to challenge Nero's authority more directly. Ancient sources suggest that around this time, Agrippina began making contact with people who might support a change in imperial leadership. Not necessarily a full coup, but perhaps a regency arrangement where she would govern in the name of a more suitable emperor. It was the kind of political exploration that in Roman terms was tantamount to treason, which from her perspective was probably necessary self-defense. This created a dangerous escalation in their conflict. Nero wasn't just dealing with a mother who knew he had tried to kill her. He was potentially facing a mother who was actively working to remove him from power. The threat had evolved from personal to political, which in Roman imperial terms meant it had become exponentially more serious. The situation was further complicated by the involvement of other political players, who saw the mother-son conflict as an opportunity to advance their own interests. Senators who had grievances against Nero's policies could potentially support Agrippina as an alternative power center. Military commanders who were concerned about the emperor's leadership might be willing to consider other options. Foreign allies who had relationships with Agrippina could potentially be leveraged in a succession crisis. It was like watching a small family argument escalate into a potential civil war, with the fate of the empire hanging in the balance between maternal ambition and filial rebellion. Nero's response to this escalation was characteristically dramatic and thoroughly Roman in its directness. He decided to abandon subtlety entirely and simply have his mother murdered by professional soldiers. No more elaborate engineering projects or accidents disguised as divine intervention, just straightforward, efficient matricide carried out by people who were paid to kill without asking inconvenient questions. The decision to use the Praetorian Guard for this task was both practical and symbolic. These were the emperor's personal soldiers, sworn to protect the imperial family. Using them to eliminate his mother was like turning the very system designed to preserve imperial security into an instrument of family destruction. It was efficient, but it was also a profound perversion of their supposed purpose. From a strategic perspective, this approach had several advantages. Professional soldiers were less likely to fail than elaborate mechanical devices. There would be witnesses to attest that the killing had been carried out on imperial orders, which would deter future challenges to Nero's authority, and the involvement of the Praetorian Guard would make it clear that this wasn't a random act of violence, but a deliberate assertion of imperial power. But it also represented a complete abandonment of any pretense that this was anything other than a son murdering his mother for political reasons. There would be no way to explain this as an accident or a misunderstanding. It would be matricide, pure and simple, carried by the emperor's direct command. The psychological implications for Nero must have been staggering. He was about to cross a line that would fundamentally change his relationship with himself, his empire, and his place in history. Killing political rivals was standard imperial behavior, but killing your own mother was the kind of act that would define you forever, regardless of what else you accomplished. For Agrippina, the final confrontation must have been both terrifying and oddly liberating. She had spent years maneuvering through the complex world of Roman politics, always calculating, always planning, always trying to stay one step ahead of potential threats. Now all the complexity had been stripped away, leaving only the fundamental question of whether she would survive the next few hours. The stage was set for a conclusion that would be definitive, brutal, and historically memorable. There would be no more failed assassination attempts, no more psychological warfare disguised as family relations, no more pretending that their conflict could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. One of them would survive the next encounter, and one of them would not. In the brutal arithmetic of Roman imperial politics, that was the only equation that mattered. The final gamble was about to be played, and the stakes were absolute. Empire versus family, son versus mother, survival versus death. Picture the most ominous sound in human history, soldiers' footsteps approaching your door in the middle of the night, when you know your own son has decided you need to die. For Agrippina, listening to the Praetorian Guard march toward her villa in March of 59 CE, this wasn't just the sound of approaching death. It was the sound of everything she had worked for, sacrificed for, and killed for coming to its inevitable conclusion. The knock, when it came, must have been almost anticlimactic. After months of psychological warfare, elaborate murder plots involving collapsible boats, and the constant tension of pretending that attempted matricide was just an unfortunate boating accident, the final act would be refreshingly straightforward. Professional soldiers with orders to kill the emperor's mother. Agrippina had spent her entire adult life understanding that Roman politics could turn deadly without warning. That there's something particularly cruel about having that violence come from the child you raised. It's like spending decades preparing for every possible threat, except the one that actually kills you, the betrayal from someone who was supposed to love and protect you unconditionally. According to historical accounts, when the soldiers arrived, Agrippina didn't try to run, hide, or plead for her life. She had been many things throughout her remarkable career. Manipulative, ruthless, calculating, ambitious. But she had never been cowardly. When faced with the final consequences of the game she had played so brilliantly for so long, she apparently decided to meet her end with the same dignity that had characterized her rise to power. The leader of the assassination squad was a man named Anicetus, who had been Nero's childhood tutor, and was now being asked to murder his former student's mother. Think about the psychological complexity of that assignment. Remember that woman who raised the boy you helped educate. The Emperor would like you to kill her now, please. It's the kind of request that would give normal people serious nightmares for the rest of their lives. But Anicetus was a professional in a world where professionalism sometimes involved activities that would horrify modern sensibilities. He had his orders, and those orders came from the most powerful person in the world. In the Roman system, following imperial commands wasn't just advisable, it was essential for your own continued survival. When the soldiers entered her residence, Agrippina reportedly remained composed. She had lived through decades of political violence, had probably ordered deaths herself, and understood the mechanics of assassination from both sides. She knew there was no point in begging or bargaining with professional killers who were following direct orders from the Emperor. But she did make one final gesture that was so perfectly characteristic of her personality that it sounds almost too dramatically appropriate to be true. She reportedly pointed to her womb and told the soldiers to strike there, saying something along the lines of "Strike here, for this is what bore Nero." Whether or not this actually happened, and ancient historians loved a good dramatic final statement, so their reliability on deathbed speeches should be taken with a grain of salt. The sentiment captures something essential about Agrippina's character. Even facing death, she was making a political statement about motherhood, power, and the relationship between creator and creation. It was also a devastating final indictment of her son. By pointing to the womb that had carried him, she was essentially saying, "This is where your emperor came from, and this is what he chooses to destroy." It's the kind of last words that would haunt someone with a functional conscience for the rest of their life. The actual killing was probably swift and efficient. Roman soldiers were professionals, and Agrippina was in her mid-40s, alone, and facing multiple armed men. There would have been no dramatic sword fights or elaborate death scenes, just the brutal mechanics of state-sponsored murder carried out by people who were trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation. When it was over, Anacatus and his men would have had the grim task of reporting back to Nero that the deed was done. "Mission accomplished, Caesar. Your mother is dead." It's the kind of conversation that probably required some very careful phrasing, even in a society where matricide was apparently within the range of acceptable imperial behavior. Nero's reaction to the news reveals something fascinating about his psychological state. According to historical accounts, he was initially relieved that the threat Agrippina represented was finally eliminated. But then, almost immediately, he was reportedly overcome with horror at what he had done. It's like finally getting something you thought you wanted and then realizing that the cost was far higher than you had anticipated. The emperor who had ordered his mother's death apparently spent the following days in a state that ancient sources describe as something between guilt and terror. He had nightmares about Agrippina's ghost. He became paranoid about divine retribution. He started seeing omens and portents everywhere, convinced that the gods were preparing to punish him for his crime. It's a psychological response that suggests Nero retained enough humanity to be horrified by matricide. Even matricide he had personally ordered. He had gotten what he wanted. Freedom from his mother's influence and interference, but the victory had come at a price that may have been psychologically unbearable. The death of Agrippina marked the end of one of the most remarkable political careers in Roman history. She had risen from being the daughter of a disgraced family to become the most powerful woman in the world. She had survived palace intrigue, political purges, family massacres, and attempted assassination. She had placed her son on the throne of the world's greatest empire, and ruled alongside him as an effective co-emperor. But she had also created the instrument of her own destruction. By raising Nero to be emperor and teaching him the ruthless skills necessary to maintain power, she had ultimately made possible the very forces that would kill her. It's a tragedy of unintended consequences. The mother destroyed by the monster she had helped create. The knock at the door had come at last, and with it, the final chapter of a life that had been extraordinary, terrible, and absolutely unforgettable. There's something uniquely horrifying about watching someone you've carefully shaped become the instrument of your own destruction. It's like teaching someone to drive and then getting run over by them in your car. Except in Agrippina's case, the car was the Roman Empire, and the accident was premeditated matricide. The woman who had spent years crafting the perfect emperor had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, and that success had killed her. In the immediate aftermath of Agrippina's murder, Nero discovered that killing your mother is the kind of achievement that comes with unexpected side effects. He had eliminated the political threat she represented, but he had also eliminated the person who had been his most experienced advisor, his most loyal supporter, and his most effective partner in managing the complex machinery of imperial power. It's like firing your most competent employee because you're tired of them questioning your decisions, only to realize that they were the only person who actually knew how to keep the company running. Except in this case, the company was the entire Roman Empire, and firing had involved professional assassins. Psychological impact on Nero was immediate and devastating. Ancient sources describe him as increasingly erratic in the weeks and months following his mother's death. He became paranoid, seeing threats and conspiracies everywhere. He started having nightmares about Agrippina's ghost coming to haunt him. He reportedly became convinced that the gods were planning some terrible retribution for his crime. But perhaps most significantly, he began to display the kind of behavior that his mother had spent years trying to prevent: the self-indulgent, artistically obsessed, politically tone-deaf conduct that would ultimately make him one of history's most notorious emperors. It was as if killing Agrippina had removed the last restraint on his worst impulses. Without his mother's guidance, or interference depending on your perspective, Nero threw himself into the artistic pursuits that Roman society considered inappropriate for an emperor. He started performing publicly as a musician and actor, which was roughly equivalent to a modern president deciding to quit politics and become a TikTok influencer. He built elaborate palaces and staged theatrical productions that consumed enormous resources while the empire dealt with more pressing concerns. The irony is almost too perfect. Agrippina had killed to secure her son's position as emperor, and now that she was dead, he was systematically destroying everything she had worked to build. It's like watching someone inherit a successful family business and then immediately convert it into a casino because they think gambling is more fun than manufacturing. Nero's reign after his mother's death became a cautionary tale about what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited self-indulgence with no experienced voice of restraint. He made decisions based on personal whims rather than political necessity. He alienated the military, the Senate, and eventually the people of Rome itself. He turned the imperial palace into something resembling a very expensive reality show about artistic temperament and political incompetence. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, which occurred 5 years after Agrippina's death, became symbolic of Nero's reign: destructive, spectacular, and possibly the result of criminal negligence if not outright arson. Whether or not Nero actually fiddled while Rome burned, and again, violins hadn't been invented yet, he certainly seemed more interested in his artistic projects than in the practical responsibilities of governing an empire. But here's the truly tragic element. Much of what made Nero a terrible emperor were qualities that Agrippina had either encouraged or failed to correct during his upbringing. His sense of entitlement, his belief that imperial power meant he could do whatever he wanted, his conviction that the rules that applied to ordinary people didn't apply to him. These were all logical extensions of lessons he had learned growing up as the heir to absolute power. Agrippina had taught him that political obstacles could be eliminated through violence. She had demonstrated that family loyalty was secondary to political advantage. She had shown him that power was something to be seized and held at any cost. When he applied these lessons to his relationship with her, he was simply following the curriculum she had provided. It's the ultimate example of unintended consequences in child rearing. The mother who had sacrificed everything to make her son emperor had also inadvertently taught him that mothers could be sacrificed when they became inconvenient. She had created a monster, and the monster had eventually turned on its creator. The Roman Senate and people, meanwhile, were discovering what Agrippina had known for years. Nero without guidance was a dangerous proposition. The young man who had initially shown promise as a ruler was revealing himself to be self-absorbed, cruel, and fundamentally unsuited for the responsibilities of imperial leadership. The empire that had benefited from Agrippina's political acumen was now suffering from its absence. By 68 CE, less than a decade after his mother's death, Nero faced widespread rebellion, military mutiny, and political isolation. The Senate declared him a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard abandoned him. Provincial governors began declaring independence from his authority. The empire that Agrippina had helped secure for her son was falling apart under his mismanagement. In the end, Nero died as he had lived after his mother's death, dramatically, self-indulgently, and in a manner that would have horrified Agrippina. Faced with capture and execution by his enemies, he committed suicide while reportedly lamenting that the world was losing such a great artist. It was the kind of death that prioritized theatrical impact over political dignity, exactly the sort of thing Agrippina had spent years trying to prevent. The dynasty that Augustus had founded, and that Agrippina had fought so hard to preserve, died with Nero. The Julio-Claudian line, which had ruled Rome for nearly a century, came to an end, because the last emperor was more interested in being a performer than a politician. Agrippina's legacy, therefore, is deeply complex. She had been one of the most effective political operators in Roman history, but her greatest success, placing her son on the throne, had ultimately destroyed everything she had worked to build. She had been both the salvation and the doom of her family line, the architect of imperial power, and the unwitting designer of its collapse. The monster she had created had indeed become emperor, exactly as she had planned. The problem was that monsters, once created, tend to destroy everything around them, including their creators. Death, it turns out, was not the end of Agrippina's influence on Roman politics. In fact, becoming a ghost might have been the most effective career move she ever made. While alive, she had been limited by the inconvenient realities of physical existence, the need to eat, sleep, and avoid assassination attempts. As a spectre haunting her son's increasingly unstable reign, she became far more powerful than she had ever been while breathing. Nero's guilt over matricide transformed his dead mother into something approaching a supernatural force in imperial politics. Every bad decision he made, every crisis that arose, every moment of self-doubt was shadowed by the memory of the woman he had killed to secure his independence. It's like having the world's most politically savvy conscience, except this conscience was also a murder victim who had legitimate grounds for holding a grudge. Ancient sources describe Nero as being tormented by dreams and visions of his mother. He would wake up screaming, convinced that Agrippina's ghost was standing at the foot of his bed, probably giving him the same disapproving look she had perfected during his teenage years. He reportedly consulted oracles and magicians, trying to find some way to appease her spirit, or at least get her to stop appearing in his nightmares with helpful suggestions about imperial policy. The psychological impact of this haunting was profound and immediate. The emperor who had killed his mother to free himself from her influence found himself more controlled by her memory than he had ever been by her living presence. It's like trying to escape someone's shadow by eliminating the person, only to discover that shadows can exist independently and tend to be much more persistent than their original owners. But Agrippina's posthumous influence went far beyond Nero's personal psychological problems. Her death had created a political vacuum that no one else could effectively fill. She had been the institutional memory of imperial administration, the person who understood how to manage senators, generals, and foreign dignitaries. Without her guidance, Nero's government began to function like a ship with a broken rudder, still moving, but increasingly likely to crash into something expensive. The Roman elite, meanwhile, began to view Agrippina's murder as a turning point in imperial history. Killing political rivals was standard operating procedure, but matricide represented a new level of political brutality that made everyone nervous about their own safety. If the emperor was willing to murder his own mother, what might he do to senators who disagreed with his policies or generals who questioned his decisions? This created a climate of fear and uncertainty that pervaded the entire imperial system. People who had previously felt secure in their positions began to wonder if loyalty and competence were sufficient protection against imperial displeasure. It was like working for a boss who had just fired their own mother. You start to question whether anyone is really safe. The ghost of Agrippina also became a rallying point for opposition to Nero's reign. While no one could publicly praise her without risking accusations of treason, her memory served as an implicit criticism of her son's leadership. People could remember when the empire had been run more competently, when decisions had been made more strategically, when imperial power had been wielded more effectively. It was a subtle form of political resistance, the comparison between what had been and what was becoming. Agrippina's posthumous reputation underwent a remarkable rehabilitation, as people began to appreciate what they had lost when she died. The woman who had been criticized for being too ambitious and manipulative was suddenly remembered as someone who had at least been competent and strategic in her ambitions and manipulations. Foreign leaders and provincial governors also began to understand that something fundamental had changed in Roman politics. Agrippina had been a known quantity, ruthless but rational, ambitious but predictable. Her death signaled that the empire was now being run by someone who made decisions based on personal psychology rather than political calculation, which made long-term planning considerably more difficult. Diplomatic relations became more complex when no one could be sure whether imperial policies reflected strategic thinking or imperial neuroses. It's like trying to negotiate with someone who keeps consulting their dead mother's ghost for advice. You're never quite sure who's actually making the decisions. The economic impact of Agrippina's absence also became apparent as Nero's reign progressed. She had understood how to balance imperial spending with imperial revenues, how to manage resources effectively, and how to maintain the financial stability that supported military and administrative operations. Without her oversight, Imperial finances began to deteriorate as Nero prioritized expensive personal projects over practical government needs. It was like removing the chief financial officer from a major corporation and replacing them with someone whose primary qualification was being related to the CEO. The results were predictable: increased spending, decreased efficiency, and growing concern among stakeholders about the organization's long-term viability. But perhaps most significantly, Agrippina's death marked the beginning of the end for the Julio-Claudian dynasty. She had been the last person with both the political skills and the family connections necessary to maintain imperial legitimacy across multiple generations. Her murder eliminated the institutional knowledge and strategic thinking that had preserved the dynasty through previous crises. The irony is that Nero killed his mother to escape her control, but in doing so, he destroyed the very system that had made his power possible. Agrippina had been both the chain that bound him and the foundation that supported him. By breaking the chain, he had also undermined the foundation. As Nero's reign continued to deteriorate, marked by increasingly erratic behavior, growing political opposition, and eventual civil war, the ghost of Agrippina became a symbol of what might have been. She represented competent governance, strategic thinking, and effective political management, all qualities that became notably absent after her death. In the end, the woman who had been killed for being too influential became more powerful in death than she had ever been in life. Her ghost didn't just haunt Nero's dreams, it haunted the entire imperial system, serving as a constant reminder of the political skills that had been lost and the stability that had been sacrificed. The empire that had benefited from her ruthless competence was now suffering from its absence, and everyone involved was beginning to understand that some problems cannot be solved by assassination. They can only be made worse. So what do you do with a story like Agrippina's? How do you process the life of a woman who was simultaneously a loving mother and a serial killer, a political genius and a family destroyer, a victim of systemic oppression and a master manipulator who used that same system to achieve unprecedented power? It's like trying to write a moral lesson about someone who was both the hero and the villain of their own story, depending on which angle you choose to examine their choices. The easy interpretation would be to dismiss Agrippina as simply evil, a power-hungry monster who killed anyone who stood between her and her ambitions. But that reading ignores the context in which she lived, and the limited options available to women in her position. She grew up watching her family be systematically destroyed by imperial politics, learned that moral righteousness was often rewarded with exile or death, and discovered that survival required mastering the same ruthless tactics used by everyone else in her social circle. In modern terms, she was like someone who grew up in a war zone and learned to fight, not because she was inherently violent, but because violence was the only currency that mattered in her environment. The skills that made her a successful political operator, strategic thinking, emotional manipulation, the ability to eliminate threats, were the same skills that kept her alive in a world where weakness was often fatal. But acknowledging the constraints she faced doesn't excuse the choices she made. Agrippina wasn't just responding to threats, she was creating them. She didn't just defend herself against political enemies, she manufactured political enemies out of family members and allies. She took a system that was already brutal and made it more efficient at brutality, which is a contribution to human misery that can't be ignored even if it can be understood. The relationship between Agrippina and Nero is particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective, because it demonstrates how trauma and power can be transmitted across generations. Agrippina's childhood experiences of family destruction and political violence shaped her into someone who viewed relationships as strategic assets and problems as obstacles to be eliminated. She then passed these lessons on to her son, who eventually used them against her. It's a perfect example of what psychologists call intergenerational trauma. The way that survival strategies developed in response to extreme circumstances can be passed down through families, often with devastating consequences. Agrippina taught Nero to be ruthless, because ruthlessness had kept her alive, but she couldn't control how he would apply those lessons or whom he would target with the skills she had given him. The tragedy is that both mother and son were probably acting rationally within the constraints of their environment. Agrippina's calculations about political survival were generally accurate. Nero's decision to eliminate threats to his authority followed logical patterns. The problem was that they were both operating within a system that rewarded violence and punished trust, which made their eventual conflict almost inevitable. From a feminist perspective, Agrippina's story is both inspiring and horrifying. She achieved a level of political power that was virtually unprecedented for women in Roman society, proving that female intelligence and ambition could be just as effective as male violence and inheritance. She demonstrated that traditional gender roles were social constructions rather than natural limitations, and that women could excel at traditionally masculine pursuits like political strategy and power acquisition. But she also reinforced some of the worst stereotypes about powerful women by using manipulation, seduction, and behind-the-scenes influence rather than direct action. She played the game according to rules that required her to work through men rather than replacing those men, which ultimately limited her ability to create lasting change in the system that had oppressed her. The modern parallels are uncomfortable, but undeniable. Agrippina's use of marriage as a path to power, her manipulation of family relationships for political gain, and her willingness to eliminate rivals through violence are strategies that continue to appear in contemporary politics, business, and social relationships. The specific methods have changed. We use litigation instead of poison, media campaigns instead of assassination. But the underlying dynamics remain remarkably similar. Her story also raises difficult questions about the relationship between personal morality and political effectiveness. Agrippina was undeniably effective at achieving her goals and protecting her interests. But those achievements came at enormous cost to other people. She was a master strategist who used her skills to create systems of oppression rather than to challenge them. She was brilliant at playing the game, but she never questioned whether the game itself was worth playing. This creates a moral complexity that resists simple judgments. Should we admire her intelligence and determination while condemning her methods? Should we understand her choices as responses to impossible circumstances, while still holding her accountable for their consequences? Should we view her as a victim of systemic oppression, or as someone who became complicit in perpetuating that oppression? Perhaps the most important lesson from Agrippina's life is that power without wisdom is ultimately self-destructive. She understood how to acquire and maintain power, but she never learned how to use power in ways that created sustainable benefits for herself or others. She was tactically brilliant, but strategically short-sighted, focused on winning individual battles while losing sight of the larger war. Her death at the hands of her own son represents the ultimate failure of this approach. She had taught him so well how to eliminate threats that he eventually identified her as a threat to be eliminated. The skills that had made her successful ultimately made her vulnerable to someone who had learned those same skills from her. In the end, Agrippina's story is a reminder that intelligence, ambition, and determination are morally neutral qualities that can be used for creation or destruction. She possessed all of these traits in abundance, but she used them in service of a system that rewarded brutality and punished compassion. She succeeded brilliantly within that system while ultimately being destroyed by it. Her legacy is complex, contradictory, and absolutely fascinating. Much like the woman herself, she was neither purely victim nor purely villain, but something more complicated and ultimately more human. Someone who did terrible things for understandable reasons and achieved remarkable success at an unacceptable cost. As we reach the end of this dark tale of family ambition and imperial murder, it's worth considering what might have happened if things had gone differently. What if Nero had remained content to let his mother share power? What if Agrippina had been satisfied with being the power behind the throne rather than seeking more direct control? What if their conflict had been resolved through negotiation rather than matricide? The answers to these hypotheticals reveal just how close Agrippina came to fundamentally altering the course of Roman history. In many ways, Agrippina represented a revolutionary possibility that neither she nor her contemporaries fully recognized. She had effectively demonstrated that women could be just as capable as men at the complex work of imperial administration, military strategy, and political leadership. Her influence during the early years of Nero's reign had coincided with a period of relative stability and competent governance. She had proved that female intelligence could be a valuable asset to imperial power, rather than a threat to it. If their partnership had continued, we might be telling a very different story about Roman imperial history. Instead of the Nero who fiddled while Rome burned, we might remember an emperor who was guided by one of the most politically astute advisors in Roman history. Instead of the collapse of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, we might have seen its transformation into something resembling a functional system of shared governance between male emperors and their female advisors. The implications extend far beyond individual personalities. Agrippina's success had created a template for female political participation, that could have been adopted by other imperial women if she had managed to institutionalize her role rather than personalizing it. Subsequent empresses might have inherited not just titles but actual political responsibilities and authority. This would have fundamentally altered the development of Western political culture. The Roman Empire's influence on subsequent European governmental systems was enormous, and the inclusion of women in formal political roles during the imperial period might have prevented the complete exclusion of women from political participation that characterized medieval and early modern European societies. But Agrippina's failure also demonstrates the limitations of individual achievement within oppressive systems. Her success was entirely dependent on her personal relationships with powerful men, which meant it couldn't survive the breakdown of those relationships. She had achieved unprecedented power for a woman, but she had done so by working within a system that was fundamentally designed to exclude women from power. The tragedy is that she came so close to transcending those limitations. For a brief period during Nero's early reign, she had effectively functioned as a co-emperor, making policy decisions and exercising real authority over imperial administration. If she had been able to maintain that position, she might have established precedents that would have changed the entire trajectory of women's political participation in Western civilization. Instead, her death marked the end of that possibility. No subsequent Roman empress would achieve the level of direct political influence that Agrippina had wielded. The experiment in shared imperial authority ended with her assassination, and traditional gender roles were reinforced by her failure to survive the challenge to male authority that her success represented. The personal cost of her ambitions is also worth considering. Agrippina sacrificed normal family relationships, personal happiness, and ultimately her life in pursuit of political power. She lived in constant danger, surrounded by people who were simultaneously allies and potential threats. She never experienced the kind of emotional security that most people take for granted, because emotional vulnerability was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her relationship with Nero, which should have been the most rewarding aspect of her life, became the source of her greatest danger. The son she loved and had sacrificed everything to protect became the person who ultimately killed her. It's a level of personal tragedy that makes her political achievements feel almost hollow in comparison. Yet she had also experienced things that few people in human history have ever experienced. She had wielded real power over the fate of millions of people. She had made decisions that shaped the course of history. She had participated in events that would be remembered and analyzed for thousands of years. She had lived a life of extraordinary significance, even if that significance came at an enormous personal cost. The question of whether she would have made different choices if she could have foreseen their consequences is unanswerable but fascinating. Would she have been content with a quieter life if she had known that her ambitions would ultimately lead to matricide, or would she have accepted that risk as the price of living a historically significant life? Given what we know about her personality and values, it seems likely that she would have chosen significance over safety, even if she had known the ultimate cost. She was someone who had witnessed the destruction of her entire family and decided that the appropriate response was to become powerful enough to control the forces that had destroyed them. That kind of determination doesn't usually come with an off switch. Her legacy, therefore, is both inspiring and cautionary. She proved that women could excel at political leadership, but she also demonstrated the dangers of pursuing power within systems that are designed to prevent you from succeeding. She achieved unprecedented success, but she paid an unprecedented price for that success. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the complexity of her story. Agrippina was neither purely heroic nor purely villainous, but something more interesting and more human. Someone who faced impossible choices and made decisions that were simultaneously brilliant and terrible. She was a woman who refused to accept the limitations that her society placed on her gender, but who also became complicit in perpetuating the systems that created those limitations. Her life reminds us that history is made by real people facing real constraints, making imperfect decisions based on incomplete information and competing values. She was extraordinary in her capabilities and her achievements, but she was also recognizably human in her flaws and contradictions. In the end, Agrippina the Younger was exactly what the title promised: Rome's Empress of murder and manipulation, a woman who achieved unprecedented power through unprecedented ruthlessness, and who ultimately became a victim of the very forces she had mastered so brilliantly. Her story is dark, complex, and absolutely unforgettable, much like history itself. Sweet dreams. And there you have it. The complete, terrible, fascinating story of a woman who murdered her way to the top of the Roman Empire only to be murdered by the son she had placed on the throne. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient family dysfunction, you know what comes next. Subscribe, like, and remember that no matter how complicated your family relationships might be, at least nobody's trying to kill you with collapsible boats. Probably.